Hey, what's happening, everyone? I'm Stephen Clinton, and this is the Essential NFL Podcast. Tonight's Monday, week 2 of the preseason, so that's going to wrap up the Cincinnati-Washington game, kicking off in a little bit here. So, and I'm recording, going to do the AFC South here for a division preview as we get closer and closer to the season here. So, we ran through a different variation of this exercise back in the spring. You can check out all of my written reports on the 32 NFL teams over at the Essential NFL Substack. Then in this version, with this podcast series, I'm just looking to challenge some assumptions, look at what's changed since I wrote up those articles and what hasn't, and also throw in some thoughts on expected win totals, strength of schedule measures, and some fantasy thoughts. So quick programming note: don't have a firm plan set for the schedule for the season. Thinking that I'm going to try to do a show maybe Friday night or Saturday morning where I can dump all my thoughts from the film each week. Maybe also do some quick hitters as I'm doing the film. At end of the day, the priorities are on getting the numbers right. In my day job as a data scientist, pricing NFL and NCAA flash bets over at Kiro Sports, and then getting the film actually watched so I can do the content. So I'm not coming into anything just yet, but that is definitely where I'm trending. Maybe some of those mini episodes, and then a longer show on Friday or Saturday, kind of looking back at the week. So. Anyways, today getting into the AFC South, and I'll go from top to bottom last year's order of finish, starting with the Houston Texans. Watching the Houston Texans on in the preseason, I think can kind of start with the positive. There's certain aspects of this that we expect to be really good in Houston this year, and I think that it's all looking positive from that regard. I mean, if you were to point to the defense and the way they played against the Carolina Panthers, I mean that was a pretty decisive performance from that group. I thought that Derek Stingley in particular played with just unbelievable amount of swagger out there is what I would say. Just on the pick, on the PBU, just a lot of presence, just showing he's there. You're really standing out there. Not that you don't expect that from guys who were first team All-Pro last year in a preseason game, but it's just nice to see that it looks like Stingley is ready to hit the ground running here. I think the same was true of any number of guys on the defensive line. Lassiter continues to look good across from Stingley, and I think that there's just even with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson injuring his leg and being set to miss some time. I mean, I think there's just so much firepower on this defense, and it's really hard to see them being anything but one of the league's best units, barring some type of injury. And defenses are notoriously difficult to predict year to year in terms of who will stay sticky and who won't. But when you've got a formula like Houston does, where you are as dominant with Will Anderson and Donnell Hunter, and then when Danico Autry is at his best, what he brings on the interior, I mean, I think that trio is about as good as any trio you're going to get in the NFL. And then you throw in the two corners who can really play like that, and a linebacker who can run like Azeez Al-Shaair, and I think it's just even if they were to take a step back from the dominant level they were playing at down the stretch, I think it's just hard to imagine, again, short of injury, this unit not being one of the more impactful units in the NFL. And then on offense, I thought that you saw C.J. Stroud come out and show pretty easy connection with Christian Kirk. Seems like he's fit right into that slot role for the Texans. And then I thought that Jaden Higgins had a nice catch on the outside. It looks like he'll be a really nice compliment to Nico Collins, who just continues to look like a blue chipper and look like he's going to be a huge piece for the Texans. And then you have the offensive line, right? And everything's just kind of reshuffled, and you're sitting there looking up different names with all the different numbers, and making sure that you've got everything lined up with the imports like Laken Tomlinson, players like Ariante Erzure who are getting out there and getting a crack. And I think the big takeaway sitting in my seat right now as I assess this and get ready for the season is there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty with Houston's line, and we'll see if we're certain about who's going to start there, but that's seems like the very rare situation in the NFL where it could just be unsettled going into the season, and it might take a little bit of time for this to shake out, because they might need some real game reps to really figure out what they've got there. But I think that it's I'm not going to sit here and anoint that group based on what they did against, a Carolina Panthers defense that just, for all the talk about the players they brought in during the offseason. I mean, that kind of at the end of the day, some pretty unremarkable players that they brought in. I'm not personally expecting, Pat Jones to move the needle for them. I think I think you just brought in, some guys that are really like they're NFL roster players, but I don't see them impacting anything. So, I don't want to read too much into Houston's performance off of that. And then, it's an interesting situation at the running back position, right, where they've got, their draft pick in Woody Marks, also, bring back Dario Ogunbowale in Houston, and then you've got the two veterans in Nick Chubb and Joe Mixon, with Mixon currently dealing with injury, and obviously Chubb coming off that's really serious knee injury a couple years ago. Again, watching Chubb in the preseason, it's hard to say that he's back to that sort of player. It looked like he was moving around maybe a little bit better than last year, but I think we really have to see him get into some games and take some hits to really have a feel on that. So, I think unsettled there, but at the end of the day, I think that, this team just brings so much to the table. And, a big takeaway I also had just watching, reviewing some notes from how Houston's season went and, exactly where things went wrong. And, there were definitely disappointing games, and the offensive line had some low moments. But at the same time, on the play that Tank Dell goes down for the season, that's C.J. Stroud hitting Tank Dell on an extremely impressive pass to get things, I believe, even, or, they're going, punch for punch with the Kansas City Chiefs in that game, right, in the regular season game. And, of course, you lose Tank Dell, very important piece at that point for the rest of the season. And then even under those circumstances, you go into the playoffs and, had a tough first half against the Chargers, but, obviously weathered the storm. And then after the snap goes over C.J. Stroud's head, everything seems to start going right for Houston. They have a really strong game there. And I thought that, they very well could have wound up beating Kansas City in that game. I thought they played a competitive game. I thought the defense was terrific in that one. And, certainly they weren't helped out by the calls in that one. I think that definitely stuck out as well in that game. But, all that to say that, obviously there were these hopes that the Texans were going to just be a supernova team and, make a clear run to the Super Bowl, just clearly assert themselves as one of the heavyweights in the AFC. And while they didn't do that, but I think that it's easy to overstate how bad it was. I guess given all those things. And yeah, there are particular concerns about units on this team, but if you look at the overall success at the end of the day and, how competitive they were in games against some of the better teams in the AFC, the Baltimore disaster notwithstanding, I think that there's just, a lot of reason to think that this organization is moving in a positive direction as we enter year 3 of this era with DeMeco Ryans and CJ Stroud and Will Anderson. And, that's not to say that they're going to be the best version of the team that they'll ever be with that group, or that they've got everything figured out to their satisfaction. But I don't know that any team in the NFL has everything figured out to their satisfaction. And I think that Houston's got just a really talented group. At the end of the day, with a reasonably easy schedule. Again, I'll get to that at the end. I think that they're set up for more success as long as C.J. Stroud is at quarterback. And he might not have been as spectacular as he was as a rookie. Maybe some issues with consistency, and certainly, some games where there's stuff that you'd like to see him be better. And but at the same time, it's not as if you watch the film and you really get through any games where you don't get reminded of what a great talent this guy is and how much arm talent he brings to the table, and how well he sees the field. So I think that expect good things there. So it also bodes well for them that they are playing in this division, because getting into some of these other teams, and specifically the defenses, certainly don't have nearly as many positive things to say about them. But moving on to Indianapolis, actually we can let's start on the other side of the ball and try to get through that a little bit quicker, because I think that the Colts offensive situation is a pretty pretty well understood situation. I feel like, throughout the fantasy community, everybody around, like, I think that there's a group of receivers that you really like there. I think the one, note maybe on that is just, I think that it's easy to forget sometimes when guys are going out there and playing that they're playing hurt, and Michael Pittman just last year was not his best year, but we all knew that he was dealing with this back situation. So I think that just even heightens the what the group brings to the table. And obviously Josh Downs coming off a really strong year in the slot. And I think that Tyler Warren in the preseason has shown that, man, he looks like he's going to be player in the NFL here. Brings good size, good speed, has good hands. So I'm excited to see more action from Tyler Warren in some regular season games against better competition for the whole game. And then Jonathan Taylor in the backfield, seems like pretty clear cut role, as this will be his backfield if barring injury. And offensive line also looking like it's all moving along, and it just comes down to the quarterbacks here. And obviously Anthony Richardson getting smoked like that, I mean, for one thing, like you would really hope that entering year 3 in the same offense that that sort of total lack of awareness thing is not happening to you, where you're like probably on the quarterback there, and even if it's not on the quarterback, to understand that in protection, and they let him loose, you'd like to have just a better feel, right, for that body coming free at you off the side. And I think that Richardson obviously had a lot of work to do in that regard. And it still seems it's a work in progress there. So we'll see what happens with him. I'm not all that much more optimistic about Daniel Jones. So it's which makes it a tough thing, because Anthony Richardson is, if nothing else, an extremely exciting player to watch. I don't know. I guess if you get frustrated enough with the games where the ball's just going all over the place, then maybe the excitement kind of burns itself out, and it's just frustrating. But I think that in general, he's still just a very enticing prospect, and it is really cool to think about what it could look like if he really did put it all together. But you just kind of get the sense that if it's still happening that fast for him in a preseason game, and he's not recognizing that there, then it's hard to really extrapolate that to thinking that the game's gonna have slowed down enough for him moving forward, that it's just gonna all resolve itself. So I think that we'll see how things shake themselves out, but we'll talk about the fantasy part of it down the road. But I think that even though there's good infrastructure and everything, I just have a lot of trouble seeing the quarterback situation really leading to a really productive or stable situation on offense. I think it's a lot more likely that it's situation kind of like last year, where it's just up and down with who's going to play. And I think the Colts are difficult team to get into for that reason. And then you flip it over to the defensive side of the ball, and certainly I think that Luanarumu is likely to do a better job than Gus Bradley, just because it had gotten so static with what the Colts were doing. But at the same time, I think that that Cincinnati defense, it was a pretty good defense on the Super Bowl run. They had a lot of very good veteran players on that defense. It wasn't a dominant defense, but they had a lot of very good players. And I think that certainly there were some good game plans involved in that run. But sometimes I wonder if the team went to the Super Bowl, right? So you're kind of attached to the success in that situation. And did Luanarumo put together some good game plans? Sure. And I think he got the most out of his players in Cincinnati, but he also, again, had really good veteran players who, Jesse Bates has gone on to, continue to make all sorts of plays for the Atlanta Falcons, to throw one name out there. Other guys have gotten older, like DJ Reader, who was, at his peak on, that Super Bowl team. And, that's all that's to say is that while I think Anarumo can, provide a boost just by, providing some level of change-ups and, having more answers for what the opponent is doing, I think that, if you look at his scheme, it's still, it's not like he's running Brian Flores stuff out there, right? Like, there was still a lot of structure to the Bengals defense. I think that it's still primarily, at the end of the day, a player-driven scheme, as, almost all defensive schemes in the NFL are ultimately going to be, because, at the end of the day, your talent's going to really dictate what you can do. And so, I guess that, I think that that's an improvement. I don't think Anarumo is a bad defensive coordinator by any means, but, like, it's also not as if, he had a great tracker, great success with developing his players in Cincinnati, and that's an organization where, as I understand it, the coaching staff, has a fair amount of input in the scouting process, because they don't invest all that many resources into the organization. So, they're kind of pulling double duty, if I'm mistaken on that whatever. But yeah, we'll see. So I think he'll be fine. But in terms of the defense itself, I just was not that inspired by the unit last year, and there's the possibility that getting Shavarius Ward is going to be a notable upgrade. I think that at his best, Ward has been if not like maybe it's interesting thinking back, because we didn't quite have the current list of names where there's a bunch of just blue chip corners, I feel like, in the NFL right now. Whether you want to mention Derek Stingley or talk about Pat Surtain, I think Sauce Gardner fits in that very easily. I think Quinyon Mitchell for the Eagles is if he's not there already, I think that it's very likely he's right in that discussion. Probably forgetting a name or two there, but that's like, in terms of just legit lockdown corners, I think that there had been just a little bit of a dip there in kind of the years after Gilmore was kind of at his peak, where just had a few things that maybe didn't quite work out. Trevon Diggs was obviously playing really well, or at least picking off a lot of passes but injuries have kind of caught up with him. Non sequitur there, but just to say that I think that the number of corners right now who are really, really good lockdown corners, I didn't even mention Christian Gonzalez, is impressive. And but at the same time, Shavarius Ward, he's probably a step down from that in terms of being a plus corner, but he's a guy who can play a variety of techniques. He can get up in your face, play man. So I think that that's a huge boost, because this Indianapolis defense, really for the last couple of years, you haven't felt like they've really been able to match guys very well on the outside, and that certainly helps everything. But beyond that, I'm not sure that the rest of the defensive backfield, I don't know if maybe Cam Bynum is going to really push the needle over the top. I think Cam Bynum was really solid in Minnesota, but I don't know that I would highlight him as the guy who's really going to drive a defense success. I think that he's more just a solid piece there, who he's not going to be a problem on defense, but I didn't personally feel like he was a dynamic playmaker for the Vikings defense. So I think they're just kind of okay there. We'll see how it works out with Zaire Franklin and the competition next to him at off the ball linebacker. It looks like they're very likely to, that's one benefit of bringing in Anarumo, is that the Bengals were a very heavy 4-2 structure with the nickel. And that sets up well with Kenny Moore being, a really good slot player, and hopefully he can maintain his play. Kenny Moore's career, out of Valdosta State. He has had some staying power, but obviously not going to be there forever. And then you have the larger question too with this group of linebackers, where it's quite unproven, and then also the Kenny Moore question, where I think that all efforts to have him play on the outside in base, you always just feel like you're kind of hanging onto your hat if Kenny Moore's lined up outside and asked to cover certain routes. So, it sets up this situation where, the Colts are probably going to be playing a lot of that 4-2 base again. And I think that there is a question right now in the NFL of, how viable a strategy is that going to be in a league where the offenses are going to, continue to lean more into running into these situations. And, a lot of that's driven by the too high looks. But, I think that there's a lot to be said for, these defenses being in these smaller packages, as well as being, I would say certainly, a secondary as opposed to the actual structure of the defense, and whether they're in too high or bringing somebody back down to the line. I would say that's the primary driver. But then after that, you're looking at how big are the players that you're getting on the field in these situations, and how well do they match up with the guys we throw out there. And if the Colts aren't going to have that flexibility, then even with some of the shifts in scheme and some of the things they can do there, they might continue to struggle to defend the run. And I think that part of that was schematic, and part of it is just the players that you're playing. Both in terms of their talent level, and then if you're going to be in nickel that much to max out the talent on the field, then the disadvantage if you're playing in this NFL that's trending towards bigger and bigger. I think that's tough. Now, this division in particular on offense, I wouldn't say there's many examples of the offenses that the Colts defense has to play against getting bigger and bigger, but I would say that that's a league-wide trend worth paying attention to. And we'll see. I think Grover Stewart's really good nose tackle. DeForest Buckner has been one of my favorite players in the league for a very long time, and Latu could certainly take a year or two step, but I think that whether it's Kwity Paye or Tyquan Lewis or any of these other guys who have been drafted first, second round on this defensive line, it just doesn't seem like they're ever gonna develop into being much more than just kind of solid players. And with DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart and Kenny Moore all getting older, and Charvarius Ward, for everything I said about the positives of him, he didn't play well last year, and he was obviously, if you're not familiar, dealing with a lot of stuff off the field with personal stuff with his family and some things related to his kid's health, which would obviously be very difficult for anybody to deal with. But at the same time, I don't think that leaving the state of California comes with a guarantee that he's going to be able to get back to form. Obviously, really hoping that he does, both for the Colts and for Charvarius Ward and his family and all. But it's the NFL, and it just doesn't always work out that way. So, I look at this Colts team, and I'm pessimistic about the whole setup. I think that there's just so much, and then you throw in the owner Jim Irsay passing away, and them making a transition in ownership, and I think anybody who follows the NFL is unaware that when you have ownership turnover, more times than not, they would like to get to the place where they have made the decision about who is in those key spots in the organization as the football decision maker and the coach. And I would be surprised at this point, unless Anthony Richardson totally turns it around in very short order, if this season is all that successful for the Colts. So definitely a bummer, because man, it looked like there's just so much upside coming out of that first year with Richardson, and obviously we only got to see the flashes, but we've seen other guys make these great developments, and the talent is clearly there. There wasn't a mistake on that, but it just hasn't gotten to where it could be, and we'll see. If he keeps working at it, then we can see a couple of years down the road. If it doesn't work out this year, it's still going to be possible for him. But if it does happen that way, then it's unlikely to be with the Colts. And I don't think you have to look a lot further than Trey Lance to find a pretty strong comparison for the Anthony Richardson situation. In terms of you bet on a guy with not a lot of football under his belt, who had really great traits and was going to need some work. And Trey Lance didn't work out with the Niners. I thought that you saw some improvement in his last start with the Cowboys at the things Trey Lance needed to work on, which are like the most basic things, right? Like just keeping your feet in line with where your eyes are as you're moving through your progression. Taking the easy throws, like making routine things look routine, as Mike Tomlin would put it. And and then I think you've just seen that carry over with what I've seen of Lance in the preseason. I watched his Hall of Fame stuff watch every snap of these preseason games just enough to kind of get a feel for where things are at. But watching Lance play right now, he's just in a different place. And it's obviously preseason, but like if you just compare the consistency, I think you see a lot of growth, and just again, so many of it's just the little things and just all these little details you have to work on when you can't just get away with being the best athlete on the field anymore. And hopefully for Colts fans, Richardson can get through that progression faster. For some of these guys, it's obviously going to take time, and in some cases, it seems like getting out of the spotlight and being able to develop in the background with a little more quiet and a little less noise really works out for guys. So all that to say that Daniel Jones, I don't know how much more I want to see of him and see that with his revival just because of the play style and everything. But Richardson's such an explosive athlete and interesting guy that you would certainly hope that he, whether it's this situation he's currently dealing with or whatever, he has the mental fortitude to keep working through it. But right now it seems like there's still a gap there. So you put the two sides of the ball together and think that it's we'll see. It could be a tough year for the Colts. At the same time, not a bad roster by any means. And if they were to have a rough season and get themselves into the quarterback derby next year, this team is really close. If this roster right here had a quarterback, and I guess this is just hitting me now, because the defense is very solid. I don't have any complaints about it. I don't look at it and see the Texans, but I think that on the last show talked about there's a wide range of defenses that are pretty much the same in terms of NFL defenses are generally only so good in the modern game with the rules restrictions. So, I could see this Colts team being quite a bit better to be frank. But they don't have that quarterback right now, and it's not looking like they have that solution. So, and if they don't, there's that question of do you want these guys to revamp it again with Ballard going into probably you're committing to him going into double digits seasons with the team at that point, and that coming off another losing season. So I think that's kind of a tough sell. So we'll see how it all shakes out for the Colts. More inclined to be down on them, but at the same time, anybody out there who's hoping that I'm wrong on that, I could definitely see it because they've got a lot of talent on this team, kind of across the roster. The offensive line. They've done a really nice job turning things over there. It's been fun to watch Bernard Raymond, continue to progress. So, we'll see how it looks for the Colts here. But, moving on from them to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think that Travis Hunter has been the theme of the offseason, right? And I think that it's been a little bit of a bummer, going from seeing him move, and when you get to see Travis Hunter move in that preseason game, watching him on film, there's no question he sticks out. And even defensively, he just has a head whip on a man turn, on a play where he's away from the play and everything. Ball doesn't come his way or anything, but just the snap he showed, it's all right. Well, you can see the movement skills are very real for sure. Easy hands, everything's looking good for him, and kind of was definitely feeling the positive vibes on Travis Hunter, and hoping to be getting him in fantasy and all. I think that him playing receiver and boosting this offense is the best path for this team to have success and the type of success they want to have, which is getting Trevor Lawrence to the next level, and then. And now Travis Hunter's hurt into the second week of the preseason, and again, that's just kind of where the concerns were. And if you go back to my article about them during the offseason, this, emphasize. I think it's a really cool story, and I would love to see that happen. But Travis Hunter got hurt playing against CSU a couple of years ago and missed a month with an injury. So it's not as if this guy is Superman. He played, every snap of every game, every year of college, and never got hurt and never missed. There was a way that they managed that at CU, and managed his practice reps, managed everything, so he was able to do that. And it's a really, really cool deal that he did that. But it's one of those things where it's just going to be difficult to hold up. Devontae Adams was talking about this, and I don't think it's hopefully it doesn't come across as disrespect at Travis Hunter for saying that it's going to be difficult to do something that nobody else in the league is doing. But I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say when you're talking about the NFL, right? These guys are the best athletes in the world, and I think just the physicality of the game, and that would be the other thing that I would point to in this discussion is that for all the positives about watching Travis Hunter in that game, against in that first preseason game. I'm blanking on the opponent at the moment, but you know, he struggled coming up in the run game and got, you know, run over at the point of attack, and he's very thin out there, and it's, you know, difficult. It can be difficult for guys with slight frames to tackle on defense. You know, we've seen that be a huge problem for, you know, a guy like former first round pick Emmanuel Forbes, who like basically just could not play. And it was clear from the get go because he was just, you know, couldn't tackle. You know, he was going against an AJ Brown, and you know, given how slight Hunter is, I think that just makes it a lot more difficult to think about playing both ways. You know, if he was built like Jalen Ramsey and playing at outside corner, then, you know, it's like, well, yeah, now you've got kind of more than enough girth to handle the physicality of the outside corner position and more. But like Hunter, it seems like, you know, if he was just a corner, I'm sure he'd be able to make it work. But man, if you're kind of, you know, having to, you know, punch above your weight, so to speak, on defense, and then you're trying to play all these extra snaps, it's just a tough proposition. So, you know, I don't know. If I'm the Jaguars at this point, like, you know, I think that you really need Travis Hunter to play one side of the ball at least, if you want to make, you know, really significant improvements here. And, you know, shoot, I'd like to see it shut down just to, you know, have him play wide receiver and do that for a year. And, you know, if this goes somewhere else, it goes somewhere else. But, you know, it's going to be a real bummer if he's, you know, holding a clipboard or standing next to the wide receivers coach, you know, come the regular season, because he's obviously a really exciting player. And then, you know, so just, you know, and I guess I can use that to roll into a discussion about the offense here. I think that if he's playing, it's, you know, really gonna be an exciting offense to watch. You know, just watching their preseason, a couple drives there, and, you know, Brian Thomas, you know, seems like he's continuing to roll along here. You know, got smoked in that first preseason game, and then had, you know, not a great drop to start off the second one. But you see that he's the guy that Trevor's looking to when he's in trouble. He's, you know, primary on a lot of things, and just, you know, continues to ball out, continues to be healthy. I mean, Brian Thomas just, you know, man, he's had an impressive start to his NFL career, and I think that he just, you know, is likely to keep rolling along doing that. You know, if they've got Travis Hunter on the other side, I think the supporting cast looks pretty good. You know, between, you know, Parker Washington and Brendan Strange and then De'Ami Brown, you know, good group at receiver. Yeah, I think that the running back group looks really solid. You know, just watching in that game, you know, we got to see, you know, Bigsby out there. You see ATN in the second series, and then Tudor was out there to be the kick returner beside Bigsby. Bigsby got the ball in the first one, but, you know, seeing Tudor a little bit. It's a really good group of running backs there. You know, I think the offensive line, there's going to be questions until they can prove it in the season, but the skill players in this group are dynamic enough, and Trevor Lawrence is a high enough end quarterback that, you know, I really expect this to be a pretty dang good offense. You know, I think Liam Cohen did a nice job in Tampa Bay last year. You actually got to see, you know, take Bigsby get a screen, which, you know, Bigsby receiving has not been a big part of his game. But, you know, I think that you saw good execution on that, you know, so it seems like Cohen getting that sort of timing and rhythm and execution into that part of the game is going to be, that's going to carry over from the time in Tampa. That's going to help out everybody from the offensive line to Trevor Lawrence. You know, it's an easy completion. It's a good play for the offensive line to get guys out. You know, you're not stressing them out with drop back pass protection in that situation. So I think a lot of positives there. And, you know, hopefully they do make a significant jump forward here, because, you know, I think it's going to be, you know, I think it's just difficult to see the defense getting a lot more than what they got last year. And, you know, I think that you do have certain, like, really positive things to build around here. You know, the defensive front, I think, the defensive line is you know, a real strong point for this team. I think that, you know, it's fun to watch, you know, Trayvon Walker just you know, continue to add to his game and grow. You know, I remember watching him, you know, first game out there, and, you know, obviously number one overall pick, all the hype, and, you know, you just could see the strength as an edge stuffer. But, you know, it's just you know, it's been a journey for him to turn that into you know, production all the time. But I mean, it just continues to happen, I think. So I'm really excited to see him get into regular season action. You obviously you've got Josh Hines Allen across from him. I liked Devon Hamilton as a run stuffer on the interior, and then the other guy that stuck out to me on film last year was Mason Smith. Just looks like a guy who's got some movement ability on the inside as a bigger body. So I think you've got that, and then of course there's the possibility of Rick Armstead, is able to provide more juice if he's kicked back on into the inside, which is more his game. But then, then I look at the back end of the defense, and I like Tyson Campbell quite a bit. I think, but you get beyond him, and I think that it's tough to see Travis Hunter, as I say, really making an impact on both sides of the ball, in a full-time role at this point. And if he's not out there, you're looking at 2024 third-round pick in Jerry and Jones playing one of the outside corner spots. Jordan Lewis, I think, is going to be he's a solid slot. I don't think of him as like an overwhelming game changer in the slot. I think that he's a player that you can add who's certainly not somebody I think is going to get picked on a lot. But again, I don't know that game changer. Yeah, kind of just a different discussion. And then they brought in Eric Murray from Houston, Andrew Wingard and him are competing at safety. It looks like Darnell Savage and Antonio Johnson could be in the mix as well there too. Depends on whose depth chart you're looking at, I'm sure, right now with some of that. But I think that there's a lot to sort out there in the secondary. At the linebacker position, we've just seen kind of the Foysad Oluokun and Devin Lloyd pairing, just has not really worked out a ton, too well for them. Oluokun has great range and tracking ability, but I think that the instincts in pass coverage have left a little bit to be desired, in particular. And then Devin Lloyd, just the instincts in general. There's just so many times where he's just not going in the right direction, and when he is, it looks good, and you see why he was a first round pick and all those things, but it just hasn't translated to dominant play at all. So the group was not great last year, and I guess that I think it would take kind of something crazy to see them turn this around completely under Anthony Campanelli will be the defensive coordinator. He comes over. He'd been working with Green Bay last year, so I think that there is the fact that they threw a lot at the wall from the back end, and there were a lot of different ideas floated around in Green Bay, but short of just making up for that back end talent, it's just tough to see that this defense being dominant. Again, I think that they're going to be pretty good because the defensive line is very, very good, but I don't think that this is a set up to be a great unit, and it's a unit that could potentially have some pretty significant issues on the back end. And it's a group that struggled on the back end, frankly, to obviously the season got off the rails pretty quickly for them in Jacksonville, with just some things going wrong in competitive games early, with one of those things being the Tyreek Hill touchdown in that game where they had played so well, but just gave those explosive plays to Miami early on. So I don't know how different that'll be. We'll see. We'll get to the win totals in a bit, but I do think that it is just likely going to be a 2-year build to get the talent really where they need to be, and that's where I think that just really letting Travis Hunter play offense and boosting that unit, trying to make that a top 10 unit, and having that to build on, moving out of this season as you attempt to accumulate more talent on this roster. I personally think that is the clear path for them to take here. But we will see once Travis Hunter is back on the field here. So the last team to talk about here is the Tennessee Titans. And man, the Tennessee Titans are a team that popping the film on and watching them in the preseason definitely gets me a little bit juiced about seeing where this is going to go. I think that obviously Cam Ward had the stat line he had, but I don't think that was reflective of his ball placement. Obviously you have a 7 throw sample. Things can go wonky, right? And nobody cares if it's 4 out of 7, and if it's 5 out of 7, it's really a nice number, right? So I wouldn't read too much into that out of the second preseason game. I thought he had some really nicely placed balls. I think that it'll be interesting to see who grows around him. You've got Calvin Ridley kind of leading that group at receiver. I think that's a big positive. Another veteran in Lockett, but the guy who frankly has me all jazzed is watching J.C. Latham move over at right tackle, and he just looks more comfortable moving around. And like Latham, even he had his rough moments playing left tackle with angles and things of that sort, but there was no question. Yeah, this dude is freaky strong, and he moves quite well for that. He's not like a Marius Mims, where Mims is like a really, really like surprisingly smooth and fluid mover for being just absolutely massive. I'd say that Latham's movement is like a little more. I don't like the word clunky because it's it just it probably implies like too much in that direction. It's just a lack of fluidity. It's just probably heavier footed. I think would be the way to play. He's a heavier footed player on the edge there, but at the same time, there's plenty of quickness within kind of that heavy footed movement. I mean, you could actually make a comparison later, but kind of like looking at T.O. versus Randy Moss at wide receiver, where T.O. like looking back in the day, like you really felt his speed, like it was just like this overwhelming raw power, whereas with Randy Moss, probably just as fast, but just smoother, like just moved easier. That type of difference between those guys, but at the same time, I think that Latham could be just freaking awesome. So it sounds like they've been going back and forth in camp a little bit. I think it's a really interesting group though. Going back and forth in camp with Jeffrey Simmons and Trash Talk, and say I'm sure they'll be ready to play some other teams here, but this could be a really, really tough football team to play against too. Just touch briefly on the defense there, and you're led by Jeffrey Simmons and Tavondra Sweat. I mean, that's as good a duo on the inside for base downs as there is in the NFL right now. Tavondra Sweat was just immovable his first year, and then Simmons complements him so well as the fluid, strong, bendy 3 technique, just kind of the prototype at that position. I think that last year this group was, they were a competitive group last year, especially because they are so good with those guys on first down for run defense. It was just they were constantly in bad situations in games, so it was hard for them to shine through. So similar to the other teams in the division, like outside of Houston, where they have that clear elite ceiling, I don't think that Tennessee's defense is going to be gangbusters, but they've got enough players that they could be pretty solid if the offense surprises in a nice direction. So I guess run through some fantasy notes here I've got on the division, and then hit the win totals, and then call it for today. I got to touch on the team. So Houston, getting back to the Torello and Randy Moss discussion, I'll get into this with a couple of receivers here, but Nico Collins to me has emerged as just like such a surefire first round receiver fantasy wise, an elite top 5 do-it-all receiver in the NFL. To me, it's that's pretty clear cut in terms of what that top 5 group is. Another guy on the list in this division, but I'd say it's Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas, and then AJ Brown. To me, are pretty clearly like the top 5 guys. Great. AJ Brown doesn't get quite the numbers and the volume of his offense, but he's just so great with his opportunities. I think that the cases for Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson have been made far and wide, but Nico Collins to me, it reminds me a lot of just that raw power of T.O. Like maybe I think that T.O. was maybe at least I remember him being a little more muscled up. I mean, he was all climber in that, but like they just feel the same way to me. Where like every time he's putting his foot in the ground, whether it's Nico Collins or T.O., just the amount of acceleration, the amount of power they're building up is just impressive. And Nico just turns that into making plays at every single level of the field. Like you feel it. If he's catching a screen, he's turning that into powerful running very quickly and able to make things happen. If he's catching a bang 8, hit it and then running over the middle, he's about to take it to the house. I mean, I love everything about the guy's game. There were several games coming back that he had big explosive gains taken back on holding calls and the like, so he could have been even more productive than he was. And so, if he's healthy this year, like, number one, I think fantasy receiver is definitely in his range of outcomes for Nico Collins. And, and even if it's not that, I think that you're going to have a guy who's crushing it for you week in, week out. I did mention, Kirk seems to fit in, everything like that. They don't have anybody else on Nico Collins' level, and he'll be a priority, and he's got a guy who can sling it to him in C.J. Stroud. As high as I am on Nico Collins, I'm even higher on Brian Thomas Jr. I'm a little bit surprised. I'm sure that the Travis Hunter edition has something to do with this, but, I think that, you almost wouldn't know, given his draft position this year, that Brian Thomas, was the wide receiver 4 last year in terms of fantasy scoring, and I don't know what there is not to love about this guy's game. Like, I'd put Jamar over him right now, but like, if I'm going back and stacking that top 5, me personally, I'm sticking Brian Thomas at number 2. And that's no disrespect to any of these other guys. My opinion of them has not dimmed at all. It was just like, pretty much from the first game you're watching Brian Thomas, it's like, holy shit, man, like, this is how you draw it up in a lap. Like, if Nico Collins reminds me some of the TO from days I was watching Brian Thomas, I'm sure most folks can guess what I'm going to say here, but he reminds me of Randy Moss. I mean, the guy is super long, and he just is unbelievably fast, and he moves like just with this easy fluidity. I mean, he's got such great acceleration. As a result, he's able to separate really, really well. I mean, I've seen Thomas do, pretty much everything well. I mean, you saw him week 1 of last season. Jalen Ramsey tries to press him up, and he gets, turned immediately, just smoked off the line, and Thomas just blew by him. He was doing the same thing to Derek Stingley late in the season. He's playing with Mac Jones at quarterback, so sometimes he's not able to pay off those plays. But I mean, I thought Thomas was just outstanding with his route running all year. There's a clip, I forget the exact game, but it's just a little snag concept where he's running the dig in behind it, and he catches the ball and takes a big hit and holds on to it. And that's the thing I love about Thomas on top of everything else, is that the speed and the length and all those things, as I said there, how you draw him up in a lab, but then you see evidence that he's just a football player, man. Like, he plays through contact. He can take a shot. I think that there's everything to love about this guy's game. I think that there's reason to think that he could wind up being just, head and shoulders, or maybe not head and shoulders because there are such special talents, but he could wind up being the best receiver in the game. And kind of having that be the consensus, because Jamar is incredibly special in his ability to elevate and what he does after the catch. Like, the guy, his elevation at his size, it reminds me of Steve Smith from when I was growing up, where like Steve Smith would go up and make these catches where he's physically dominant at the catch point, despite just not being the biggest dude out there. And Jamar reminds me of that in a little bit bigger package. And then he's just once he catches it, who knows. But at the same time, if you're drawing it up in a lab, tendency for receiver, if you were to talk what's the prototype, you'd be talking 6'4", 6'5" with 4.3 speed, and good change of direction and good stopping ability and good subtlety of route running, and all that's Brian Thomas. And so a lot of receivers to love out there right now, but to me, he's got all the potential in the world. So like the rest of the guys they brought in, like they're compliments. They're not. I don't think they're going to cut into his target share. Watching the rapport that he has with Trevor Lawrence, I think that's even more true. Parker Washington, Brendan Strange more broke out, back half of the season after Lawrence was hurt, and then you're incorporating other guys. So I think that BT7 is the one really sure thing in this offense, even with Travis Hunter there, because he is just the established player. Now he's the one on the field throughout training camp. Hunter's missing time right now, so I think that Thomas is just going to continue to do what he's been doing, and he's seems to be pretty darn durable too, on top of everything else I've had to say about him. So I'm a big Brian Thomas guy, and I wouldn't blink to take him in the first round of the draft. So pretty happy when I can. So hopefully that all continues to move in a positive direction. Group that I'm less high on, and but at the same time like all the players in, is just this Jaguars running back room. Just looking at Basil Tuden throwing his highlight tape. I mean, this dude is explosive. I mean, he can rip off some long carries, and I think that he could definitely have a role. At the same time, looks like Tank Bigsby is, if he's not where he was last year after taking a big step forward after his first year, he might be an even better player going into year 3. got to see him, catch a ball in that drive in the second preseason game, which that just him getting set up on a screen that just has not been part of his game. So who knows if in this new offense with this new coaching staff if they can get more out of him there. And then Trevor Etienne's man, it's gonna mess me up having his brother in the league, but Travis Etienne is in there for the second series, catching balls, continuing to run well. He's got first round pedigree, so I think you've got a situation where you've got three very capable backs. Maybe it works out like Tampa Bay last year, where Sean Tucker, he's in reserve, and if he gets a chance, he can play very well. Maybe that's Basil Tuden this year, and it's Tank Bigsby, and it's Travis Etienne, splitting in the carries. But it does look like it's probably going to be a split workload there, and I think it's just hard to peg which guy's going to get it, and then with a third guy that they could potentially like. It's just, I think, dicey fishing. So no, I think that you're going to have productive backs there. If Trevor Lawrence is healthy, I think this offense is going to score points. But just where exactly who are they going to go to? What's the distribution going to look like week to week? I think those are all going to be very difficult questions to answer here. So we'll see how it all works out. But I think that makes it difficult to draft this Jags running back room at the moment. We talked about the Colts, like all the pieces. Jonathan Taylor, I think, is a really solid pick at his ADP just because he's got such a clear role. Good offense, but I think that the rest of the receivers, I'm kind of my projections have them pretty close to ADP, kind of across the board for the Colts guys. But at the same time, in that range, like I'm usually leaning to somebody else in that tier. I just I think that the potential for the downside case in Indianapolis is a lot higher than the potential for the upside case, I suppose. Even though, as mentioned, do see the upside case. But kind of shying away from those guys. Tennessee have some guys definitely like. I think that Calvin Ridley is going to be a really solid pick this year. Just set up in a good position. I think that Cam Ward. I think that there's a lot of positive from what you're seeing from him. Hearing about him, all the things. So I think that Ridley, is had some good games last year, even with poor offensive structure around him. It's looking like this Tennessee offense is going to have some pretty decent structure with what the offensive line is able to bring to the table, and then you bring in the fact that Ridley is by far the most established guy, and the other thing I'm looking at with Tennessee for sure is some of these down the list guys, whether it's wide receivers or tight ends, like the name I'll throw out there is Eric Iomonor, Stanford kid, but there's also the tight end Gunnar Helm, who we'll see. Like Chigo Okonkwo is likely to have his role, but Gunnar Helm could potentially get in the mix. Ionomore could get in the mix. They've got some guys like Chamari Dyke, Xavier Restrepo, and we know that there's just strong possibility of finding playing time in this Tennessee offense. Whereas I think that there's a lot of those mid round guys who outside of the is it Thornton? The Las Vegas receiver, their fourth round guy who looks like Martavius Bryant, looks just like him to me at least. What's his name? Dante Thornton Jr. Sorry, it looks like he's got clear route to playing time. But then outside of that, if you're talking about mid round picks, in terms of guys that could wind up impacting the season for a while or being a really good stacking asset, if Cam Ward hits, or you are using this group in a specific matchup, trying to get an idea of who those guys are going to be, because Van Jefferson with his drops and everything, you just feel like he's not long term. Tyler Lockett not probably a long term piece for this offense when the offense is really at its best version. So kind of figuring that out, and if it's Iomonor, gosh, that's terrible. Doesn't even look that hard until I started trying to pronounce the Ayomanor, Iomanor. But yeah, so if you can figure out who that guy is going to be, if there's a young guy who is going to grow with Cam Ward, I don't think that the Titans have any reason to hold that player back, right? If Tyler Lockett's a vet, I'm sure that he'll handle it appropriately, and Van Jefferson is he's been a rotational piece throughout his career, so it's not as if he's not going to be able to handle it if his role changes. So we'll see if one of those players emerges. But I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on in fantasy. That could definitely help you out if you need to address receiver or take an upside pick near the end of the draft or something like that. Actually, I'd probably not even talking about something that you'd be doing in redraft here, but just as the year goes on, I think being ready to jump on one of those young receivers if they prove themselves for Tennessee makes a lot of sense, because assuming things go moderately well for this Tennessee offense, it makes all the sense in the world for them to try to find some younger players who can kind of grow with this offense rather than some of the older pieces or journeyman pieces that you just don't see being a core part of this team when they're challenging for the AFC South title down the road, if that is indeed the path they take. So to wrap the show up, just run through some win totals here. So I've got my composite schedule that has each team playing against all 31 other teams, both home and away, and then I've got their expected wins for this year, which that comparison allows me to say, hey, this is what your expected wins would be if you just played like a neutral schedule. So who's got the hardest schedules, who's got the easiest schedules, and much like the NFC West, who I've already talked about, AFC South, generally favorable schedules to play against here. So starting with Houston, I'm actually a little bit higher on them than Vegas. Vegas has their win total is about 9.5. Is some discrepancies in that with so many totals being available, but just looking for the most balanced numbers. I've got them at 10.19 expected wins. I have the schedule is the 15th most difficult, which is for a team that won their division, that's pretty darn favorable. So I have them as a 0.12 differential compared to the 10.07 they would have on a composite schedule. So about the same. End of the day, pretty neutral schedule in terms of difficulty for the Houston Texans. As I say, there's a lot of positives. I can see the clear downside if the offensive line doesn't get better, but then again, the offensive line was quite bad last year, and they still won the division going away. And it's a good group. And Indianapolis, I've got them at 5.9 expected wins. 12th most difficult schedule. They've got a plus 0.37 differential compared to their composite expected wins. Vegas has them at 7.5, so Indy would be the team I would take the under on in this division. I think that's a pretty clear one. I think that, despite the overall roster talent here, I just see a clear case for the bottom to fall out. And, obviously they still go a different way, but it doesn't seem like, they're, just hitting all their checkpoints in the preseason run up here, and nothing's, and everything's going to plan. It doesn't feel that way. The Jacksonville Jaguars have them at 7.37 expected wins. They've got a plus 0.42 differential, so that's the seventh most difficult schedule in the league, so quite favorable again. Vegas has them in the 7.5, 8.5 range, so 8.5 at a decent price. I'd probably play the under there, but I'm pretty similar to what Vegas has on them. A little bit to the low side. I think I am lower on their defense, and the downside of the offensive line there. Despite my excitement about some of the skill position stuff with Trevor Lawrence coming back. We'll probably stay away from that one, though. I think they're probably about properly valued. And then, we got Tennessee here. I've got them at 5.72 expected wins. Fourth most difficult schedule in the league. I've got them at 6.35 expected wins. Composite expected wins would be 5.72, so plus 0.63 differential there. So, that's the fourth most difficult schedule in the league, so definitely a positive part of it. Vegas has them at 6.5 wins, so essentially have it pegged the same as the market there with Tennessee. We'll see. But overall, still very excited about this division. It's a bummer about Hunter, and hopefully he's back on the field soon, because he's definitely somebody who would add some juice to this NFL season. But I think that's about it for today. Gonna hop off here, see how this test runs on tonight's game. So hopefully things are running along pretty well. But I'll get back to talking about the rest of the NFL in the days to come. So if you're enjoying the series, definitely keep tuning in to check it out. Have a great one, everyone.